Nietzsche continued his restless journeying around Europe. Although his health was deteriorating, it didn't stop him from writing a subversive work called Beyond Good and Evil. Nietzsche himself thought the book was terrifying. A Scoid-like work that confronted all the dark realities that 19th century science had laid bare. He couldn't find anybody to publish it, so he paid for it to be printed himself. And when it was released in 1886, the reviewers hated it. They described it as dangerous dynamite. Both this book and his next, The Genealogy of Morality, were fired by Nietzsche's utter dismay at the persistence of Christianity's moral values. Whilst many 19th century intellectuals had rejected the faith, they maintained its values. For Nietzsche, this was a catastrophe. For him, they no longer just lacked divine authority, they were a threat to the future of humanity itself. Why should we try to understand this book of his, Beyond Good and Evil, if we're going to try to understand Nietzsche?
Well, this is a book where he really begins his incredibly intense campaign against Christianity. And he says the real logic of Christianity is a hatred of our own human, all-too-human nature. That is, we have various drives, according to Nietzsche, sexual drive, aggressive drives, drives to dominate. And Christianity says those drives are an affront to God. We need to push those drives down. But for Nietzsche, that means we need to push ourselves down. So he thinks that Christianity teaches us kind of a self-evisceration, a self-hatred. That is his critique of Christianity.
And what does he think is wrong with a fundamental Christian moral value?
Well, he looks at Christianity and he very disparagingly calls it slave morality. And he calls it slave morality because he thinks it's a morality that is focused on the worst off. That is, the slaves of ancient Rome, who were the weak ones and needed a religion that gave them a sense of meaning, a sense of power. But they had no power in this world, so they try to, he says, and he puts it so powerfully, they lie their weakness into a strength. So he thinks these Christian values, humility, poverty, meekness, he thinks these are values that make it safe for the weakest in society. But he thinks eventually, when these values triumph and become everyone's values, they inevitably make forward mediocrity.
But his criticism of the weak really troubles me, because these are works that have no time, it seems to me, for the weak, for compassion.
Yeah, it's not that Nietzsche thought we should step on the weak. What he thought is we shouldn't be obsessed with the weak. And that's so strange to us, because he's thinking, and what's wrong with compassion? But he did have a problem with compassion.
Is this one of the reasons that he's so anti the emerging isms of the day, so socialism, communism?
Well, a lot of communists, a lot of socialists may no longer believe in God, but they still have this core Christian value of compassion. And Nietzsche says when you're obsessed with compassion, when you're obsessed with how the worst off are doing, that gets you into a mentality where what is valued is contentment. He calls that herd happiness, and he says that is only worthy of animals. We are worthy of so much more. And he says if you gear everything to making the worst off as well as possible, you take your eyes off the idea of the great individuals who often are extremely egotistical. We would say selfish. But he says they need that selfishness to make their achievements, because it's their achievements that really drive civilization and culture at its highest peaks.
Christian morality was something that Nietzsche believed was positively dangerous for the future of mankind. If humanity was to survive, it needed the great individuals, the very geniuses that he thought the slave morality of Christian culture was holding down. But there was a system of values that he did admire. He also talks about master morality. What's going on there?
He's hearkening back to the world of the ancient Romans and the ancient Greeks. They were both massive slave-owning societies. But he said these people were masterful in a way that with their gods, they celebrated themselves. Like someone like Achilles, the great warrior, he could worship Ares, the god of war. But in doing that, he was worshipping himself. So he says the masters have a religion that affirms themselves, whereas the slaves have a religion of Christianity which actually disavows their nature.
The master morality of the Greeks, as Nietzsche saw it, glorified ambition, strength and power, and despised compassion. Nietzsche was convinced that a revision of moral values was needed for a post-Christian future, and that such a morality needed moral legislators. In his letters, he announced that his next task was a magnum opus, in which he would lay out a new value system to fill the void. But it wasn't to be.